with them how to apply it,
Mhm.
and also how to apply it in the current setup so that it can be reference on how to apply it during the migration.
Mhm.
Because most of the APIs in CXS have conditional mandatory handling, because especially when the APIs are shared for both NG1 and Gore or other non-logged in consumers, because the user token header is specifically used only for NG1
NG1.
because they have a login capability, while the OTP one is mainly used for consumers without that login capability. So specifically for Gore. Gore is the main consumer for the OTP APIs.
And what about uh, the legacy Gore? What it was?
Globe Online.
Global Line, yeah.
They have the same implementation. OTP is used for them as well. So the ones with the CXS APIs are shared between them. There's usually a conditional mandatory handling. So uh, those are the approved security implementation. So it restricts the user. I mean, it restricts the access that is being passed to the API, so that uh, it can be identified to the whether the user token or the one where the OTP was sent to. So that's why there's an implementation like that. And since it's used by multiple consumers, so there's a conditional mandatory handling. So it's either you pass a user token or the OTP. So the conditional mandatory handling is basically handled in Joy. So there's
Mhm.
the XOR handling.
Yeah.
Well, aside from that, because usually when there's a user token, there's an enroll account whitelist handling. I can share you the Confluence page where I've listed there the common security features in CXS. So the ones that I commented to be applied as part of the pre-handler is for handling of both. So there, because there's a condition there that if there's a user token, if there's no user token pass, then uh, it will not validate it. But if a user token is passed, it will check the enroll accounts. Well, same goes for OTP. So that's why there's a specific handling for those security headers.
Okay.
I'll present it here in the MR. So before that, I usually have a sequence that I follow in terms of the actual code review. The first one is I usually check first the request validation. So in the old repo, there's only validation for the request parameters,
Mhm.
which can be found in the validate schema. I usually check this as well in the IFS or the API documentation, but in this case, aside from that, also the YAML files that's generated. So I usually check this if this align with both documents.
Mhm.
So in the current flow, like the current repository, it only validates the request, but in the new implementation, it validates both request and response. So I
Yes.
usually check this first if it's aligned with the current implementation. While for the response, I, I usually check that the handler level. So that's where
The response is also available in the IFS documentation.
yes, but
Also, the new repo, it does not validate for response. It just mentions that schema and there is a parameter called sample zero.
yes,
So sample zero just lets it pass, but it is helpful to create the Swagger document.
yes, that's one. So that's why I usually check. Cross validate here the ones in the handler level. So I just check from the implementation and also in the IFS as well if it's aligned the ones listed here in the response one. So that's the first thing that I usually check is more on the requests and now the response validation. Then aside from that is more on, and next is more on the actual repositories. And repositories is the term that we use in the old, in the current repository. While for the new one, it's
Just repositories.
yes, it's just repositories.
In the order, it was services and then repositories, and now
Yes.
it's just repositories directly.
I the one that I notice here is because the some of the functions is already declared in the request in the plugin declaration, while the one listed here in the current repository is some of it is declared from the environment variable, while some of it is uh, being passed from the request. So that's the one that will be new when in terms of the actual reviewer, but in terms of the actual implementation, it's aligned as well. So the ones that I check here is more on how it was implemented in the current repository, whether it's using uh, the shared SOAP function, or if it's direct HTTP call. But in this case, both APIs, I know the one for credit info is using the SOAP one, while the one for loan promo is using the HTTP client. So the implementation for those is aligned for both repositories listed here.
Mhm.
Then the next one that I usually check is more on the handler. But
It is services now.
yes, the handlers here is the services in the repository, but there's more of because the one implemented in the handler is all of the utility functions are declared here, while the one developed in the new repository is a combination of both the services, and it also has separate utility functions. So I just checked the implementation for the separate utility function if it's aligned with what's it's currently implemented. Um, these two APIs are pretty straightforward, but in terms of when um, the APIs that we migrate is has some more complex solution. Usually, once the check is more on for like process improvement, if there's like duplicate flows like that, because the ones that I reviewed here, the only one that I recommended is the security implementation handling, because what was listed here is it's applied in the handler level. But when I discussed with you both during the security implementation discussion, is this is applied in the plugin level. So that's why I commented in this MR that it should be changed to the pre-handler so that it will be aligned for um, most of the CXS APIs with user token and OTP handling. Then the one that I checked last is, since the handlers, repositories, and models are all packaged in the plugins in the current repository, but that in the new repository it's now in the routes.
Yeah.
So there's also a few differences here because there's no more server decorators here. It's all declared in the
Global dependent.
yes, the global dependencies in the index.js. So that's one thing to take note of. Then aside from that is basically the pre-methods and the actual files that was used. So this is the handler, the validator, and I both request and response validator. So the one that I commented is this part, because since it's a conditional mandatory handling, if you check this function, it will not it will only validate the OTP reference ID if there's
It's being passed.
it's being passed. Same goes with the user 211. So if it's specified that it's conditional mandatory handling on the IFS, then this will be the approach for that. But some of the APIs require both. So it will still work because it will validate both once there's a specific header that's passed.
Yeah.
Then some APIs only require one. So the only needed function should be declared in the pre-handler one.
Yeah.
Well, for the unit test, I'm not that uh, strict in terms there because I usually check it's more on the code coverage part. So specifically if it passed the set, so that's why I required to have a separate UTC documents because when I run the unit test from the local for this current setup, it passed code coverage. So that's I'm only looking for the document for that one. But in terms of the actual implementation, uh, most of this is still the same, like the ones used for Xenon for the stubbing. So there's only a few um, changes that were applied here. So in terms of the actual implementation, I'm not that strict on that one.
Yeah, same for me. In unit tests, I generally see basically the code quality.
Yes.
If what the test is saying is being actually written in the test, or sometimes I also check if the test case is descriptive enough. Sometimes they will just write a test case. Should return success if no failure, which means nothing. um, what is the input? What is the output? Some things like that you should be mentioning in the test cases.
I think that's all how I review the actual migration. It aligns to make sure that the ones implemented in the current one is aligned, and also always look for improvements as well. But in terms of these two APIs, it's pretty straightforward because the flow is only aside from the security features, it's basically a pass-through API in CXS. But for the next, actually the other APIs, the ones in OCSP and data currency, they're all pretty much pass-through as well, if I recall them correctly. But the ones in the later batches, that's where there is more complex. Yes.
For OCSP, I changed the code structure quite a lot. It's much more simplified now. Also, some of the conventions that we follow is, let's say, in a service, there is a utility function that is calling something external. Rather than putting it in the same file, we create a different service out of it and call service to service. So it's a bit more cleaner that way. And in Rush service, I reviewed, there was a recursive function invoke SSO API. Yeah. So, and that if you look at the legacy implementation, it took me about an hour to understand what's happening. But it's much more simplified now. So basically, my guideline to code reviews is if you can't easily understand what is being written, then it's wrong. So like you should not be putting a lot of effort to understand what code there is. It should be very easily be understandable. So yeah. So
Are there any like additional topics that you have in mind?
yeah. So one of the areas where I I was thinking you'd be there is during debugging. So what has happened in the past with some of the other migrations with some other customers? Obviously, something breaks.